I think it's even worse than it's something. It's like, well, these people just aren't smart,
Hmm.
right? That's
Yeah.
all, to me. That's all. I don't know if you guys feel the same way. It always feels like, well, you could read the fine print. You knew what you were doing. No one was trying to pull the wool over your eyes. It's all right there. It's like, but not everybody has the same opportunities. And when you're already operating kind of right above homelessness constantly, um, a bad day, a downsizing of a job, hours cut from a job, people that are working within the gig economy as that ebbs and flows. So does people's ability to pay these loans back because, again, the interest rates are so astronomical. It may make sense on some level to take that money out initially, right? Like I'm going to do this because you talk about this in your book. These women are starting businesses from the Sierra Leone context. It's when we say start a business, sometimes the businesses they're starting they're so small. Like I'm just going to get some stuff from over
Yeah.
here and sell it on this side of the street because there's no one selling fruit on this side of the street. So I just need money to buy fruit. Um, it's I feel like for me, reading this kind of laid bare the fact that we really hate any sort of state-sponsored social services
That's what I
as a
was going
nation. Oh, go ahead, Pascal. Go ahead. You
I
can
was
elaborate with bigger
oh,
words.
one of the things I was going to say is that did you notice how much these processes are contingent on an inability of the state to provide services for the citizenry? Like the lack of the availability of a healthy state government is part of the mechanism that allows these microfinancing schemes to flourish. And I think that one of the things that we notice is that, for example, when you said that the IMF was demanding that the central banks of the African countries where microfinancing were existing stay deregulated, illustrates how neoliberal capitalism functions in an order where state functionality is neutralized almost intentionally.
Yeah. So one of the things I looked at was actually the history of NGOs. And so now we think of NGOs as like just a thing that exists in the world, right? If you think about international aid, international development, international health work, you think, oh, there's like an NGO in wherever that works on that, right? An NGO in Kenya, an NGO in India that works on health issues, for example, or economic issues. And we just think of those as kind of baked into the world as it exists. But NGOs are actually a really new phenomenon, particularly in international development. And so I looked at how NGOs, nonprofits, and non-governmental organizations really started to have a larger and larger footprint during structural adjustment programs. And so this was a period in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, in which the IMF and the World Bank were essentially saying to governments, you need to cut public funding and you need to liberalize your economy. So open your economy to imports, deregulate your financial sector. And the result of structural adjustment programs, as a lot of other people have written about, was devastating for many countries, and particularly for public services in those countries. And so, as healthcare became privatized and became smaller, as education became privatized and there was a smaller footprint by the state, NGOs really were there to kind of fill the gaps, right? And those NGOs are just to be really clear, are private organizations and often funded in part by Western governments. And so, I mean, that sounds kind of conspiratorial, and I don't mean it to be that. Really, there is that very well documented that pattern that as poorer country governments were being encouraged or forced to take these programs, take these steps in order to reduce the size of the state programs and increase the size of private actors, that NGOs were really there to fill the gaps. And this happened at the exact same time that microfinance started to rise. So the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, this proliferation of NGOs was really mapped onto the proliferation of microfinance, right? So both the idea of, okay, well, the state has gotten smaller or has been forced to get smaller. And so there'll be private organizations and private finance there to fill the gaps. I think that's a really important thing to understand when we talk about microfinance. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book is because the history of microfinance, which really, as I said, is from 1970 till today, maps on almost perfectly to the history of international aid. Right. So understanding why microfinance became as popular as it did, why it was supported by progressives and conservatives at the same time, and also how it fit this kind of worldview of, okay, the state is going to get smaller, and these private organizations, private finance, is going to fill that void. And so the book is very much about microfinance, but really traces the history of microfinance along that history of international aid, and kind of unpacking these things that we think are just normal now, right? That, oh, of course, if you were going to give or support, let's say, water access in Kenya, you're going to do it through an NGO. But that's actually a really new phenomenon. That's within people's lifetimes, right? That's been true. And so I think that's a really important understanding, history to unpack, and understanding that, in addition to understanding the way that those policies work now. But I think more kind of, I really wanted to understand, like, how did we get here, right? How did we get to the point where the women in Sierra Leone, the only way that they understand to be able to access cash is through microfinance, and they need that cash to pay for private services, private healthcare, private education, private water, etc.